Livestock integration. It's one of the 6 principles of soil health, but how do we do it on cropland? Well, today on the Working Cows podcast, we're going to talk to Matt Goble, and he's going to talk to us about, among other things, how his sheep improve some of his forage crops.
Is if I can graze those sheep on that alfalfa between April 15th and May 15th really fast, the weevil goes down. You hit the weevil, the hoof action knocks a lot of that weevil. And the alfalfa at that time's hot, and they avoid it, but they go for all the weeds. And then you get them off of there, and your yields, it does nothing to your yields, essentially. In fact, I found that it'll increase your yields because essentially you fertilized at the same time with the sheep, and then you got rid of most of the competition.
We're also going to talk to him about some of his gripes with that is ranchers and cow people's terminology, quote unquote, terminology.
Yeah, sandhills lambing. Well, we call it drift lambing. We invented drift lambing before the sandhills calving method. So it's really, they stole that from the sheep guys. That was my great grandparents.
Yeah, did you hear that, Derek? Derek, I hope you're listening.
That's all we say. You cow guys always steal it from the sheep guys first. So I even watched the deal on in herding, and it's the other night. I can't think of their name. He'll probably, if he hears this, will see me out. And I'm like, why can't we just call it herding? Because you stole it from the sheep guys. But it's in herding because a cowboy can't say that, right?
As well as the difference that some of the people that come and visit and that he hires to contract on his operation notice about his land.
He's like, I know what you're doing. I says, I watch you all the time. I can feel the difference in your ground in my swather. I can feel the difference in your ground compared to everybody else I cut for.
All that and more on this episode 422 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by PowerFlex Fence Supply.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. Very excited to be joined by Matt Goble. Matt is a 6th-generation sheep producer from Utah, and he's also an educator with a local community college, and so he's managing all that while grazing a bunch of ewes in net fencing and some of those things. So we're going to talk to him about that and the improvement he's seen over time in his land as a result of this strategy. Very excited to share this conversation with you right after a word from our sponsor today, Range Ward. Range Ward builds all-in-one solar-powered electric fencing machines for the serious grazer. Their units feature powered reels, built-in solar chargers, and step-in post storage, saving you labor costs, increasing your profitability, and enabling you to spend your time on other projects. Range Ward's time-saving machines can be found on hundreds of thousands of acres across Canadian and U.S. pastures, ranging from small hobby or homestead-style farms to massive privately owned or corporate-run pastures and grazing co-ops. Every unit is designed from the ground up to include feedback from working producers and is built in Range Ward's advanced manufacturing facilities in the U.S. and Canada. Range Ward offers a full lineup of fencing solutions, from the Power Grazer, capable of handling 30 miles of fencing, to the all-new Power Reel, delivering Range Ward quality and efficiency in a lower-cost package that will mount on an ATV or side-by-side. To learn more, visit rangeward.com. Matt, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Short of running the Working Sheep podcast, I'm always excited about the opportunity to talk about sheep, but I'd like to talk to you a little bit today just about how you guys are handling sheep there on your operation and some of the history that your family has with sheep. So let's start there. What is kind of the history of your family and their sheep operation?
If I go back, I'm 6 generations actually in this. So my family's originally from England. They even say that they they ran sheep there, I guess, and got here, and like much of the western United States, we're predominantly public land. Utah is 70% public land, and they started raising sheep when they got here. Traditional range type operation where the sheep herds are moved to the mountains in the summertime and to our desert rangelands in the wintertime. And about the 1970s, right? They had about 2,500 head, which is two bands of sheep. They kind of had experienced some losses. I was talking to you earlier about they lost 800 head of sheep one night, and the vet talked about halogeton poisoning, and I actually found the old vet reports and looked it up because you could never convince my grandma that's what it was. She always claimed something else, and there was a lot of nuclear testing and kind of found out some of that area had been used before. So we don't know, but that along with wool type issues that during the 70s, 80s really hit them, and they were ready to get out. I had some great uncles that were basically to that point of, hey, we're going to get out of the sheep, and so they got out of the range operation. And my dad, he always kept a herd of sheep, a little farm flock, and worked for some farmers in the area. And then I was crazy enough that I liked the livestock business and got into the sheep production. And my wife and I now have about 550 ewes. Well, anywhere from about 450 to 550, just kind of ranges depending on the year. And then we've shifted. So when I got out of college, I was the same frame of mind. I was going to try to be a range operator and trying to find those public land permits. It's really difficult. It's not like they're just sitting there for sale and you can get them. A lot of times it's word of mouth or family members and things like that. But I was actually able to pick up a couple private type leases, and we got up to about 650 ewes, I think was the top. And this was predominantly me and my dad. And I herded the sheep. I was the sheep herder during that time, and I was working a job too. And this is one of the reasons, one of the big shifts that got us to where we are today was I remember taking those sheep on the mountain, and predators were very hard, and we'd night pen and guard dogs and everything else and be there, most of the time. And I remember we would lose 150 lambs on this one area. And that for somebody with 500 lambs, that's a huge hit. And I always said, if I had 1,200 lambs, I'd still lose 150 lambs, right? It wouldn't matter if there was what number was there. And so it kind of got a little wearing, and I thought there's got to be other things. And I had heard of Jim Garish and some of the things he was doing. And so this one fall, we had one piece of ground that he says, I'm not going to cut this for hay. Go ahead and throw your sheep on there. And I had a group of these yearling ewes, 150 something yearling ewes. And I started basically moving them across the pasture every day. And finally realized when I got to the end of the pasture, I had feed on the other side of the pasture again. And so I jumped, I was like, hey, this is great, and so that's what really got me into where we're at today. About 9 years ago, we were able to purchase 120 acres of irrigated ground. And we predominantly, from about mid-April until we just moved them off of that about 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, did a little bale grazing at the end with them. But again, that's our operation is we move sheep every day, especially during the growing season. And I found that's really worked for us. And that's kind of where we're at today with that operation and how we kind of got there. So
mid-April to mid-January then? Is that about right?
Yeah. So about mid-April, things start growing. And I don't really, about mid-May is when you get a ton of growth. So by mid-May, I can usually bring the majority of them there. I do have a little bit of rangeland lease that I can go to in between, which works really well for us as far as that aspect goes. So, and that's one of those things, I kind of brought up was earlier too with you was a lot of our federal leases, I learned a lot from being around those sheep and grazing habits and what they wanted to go to. And you kind of mentioned a lot of hair sheep back east, a lot of wool sheep here. And a lot of that is that gregariousness or that hardiness that those sheep have to, one guy can have 1,000 ewes and their lambs and keep them in a herd on that mountain. So
that is a fascinating piece of that puzzle for sure. So you mentioned that early kind of transition and then the grazing experiment on the land that wasn't being cut for hay that year. What was kind of how did you approach that year from an infrastructure perspective? What was the fence and water scenario like in that scenario?
Yeah, so a lot of our farmland, so it's most of it's an irrigated system, irrigated with wheel lines or side rolls, and so basically you've got a riser every 40 feet. So we can pull off of that, put a bonnet on there, and have I actually only use for those ewes. I have a 60-gallon trough that's got a float on it, and that's plenty for those ewes to keep up with them and keep things going. And then fence wise. Boy, I tried everything. I will tell you, every time I talk to people, I say I've done from poly wire to steel wire, you name it, I've done it. And I finally settled on net fencing just because it's so nice, especially wool sheep. You got to shock their face. So the one time it was funny, I had a 3-strand poly wire up, and my aunt and uncle went to check the sheep for me one day, and they said those dirty things, they knew exactly if they stuck their head under that wire. And they said, we swear the one held the fence up while everything else went under it and took off. And it was true. So, but, I learned a lot on fencing. I've put both up on mountain ranges. Even I've had some mountain pasture leases, and I've ran poly wire and net fencing in some of those places. So anyway, I've learned a lot on that. But we actually go with the net fencing just because, on that irrigated land, the production is pretty high, and so my pastures. I mean, I'm looking at just over an acre and a quarter for those 400 ewes for a day, and so it doesn't take a whole lot of fencing between my wife and my 2 girls. We usually have the sheep moved, have the water moved, the next pasture built within 45 minutes. So it's pretty nice. We've kind of got a pretty good program that we figured out with that, and that's worked great for us. So.
Yeah. And kind of the net fencing, is that?
Yeah, I will tell you the truth. When I first started, when we bought this ground, that ground was as hard as a rock. And I bent a lot of those little 2-prong posts. And today, I actually buy just the single spike. My soil has benefited so much. I can push those single spike right in the ground. So anyway, but now it's amazing to see the change over the years and see that, just that little single spike fence works now, and I never thought it would. But
yeah, no, absolutely, that's good. We've had good luck with the net fencing. We've been trying to figure out the labor side of that, and have been experimenting for the last couple of years with 2 and 3 wire, fencing, and they're in till they're bored or hungry, but I don't think they're hungry. They're just bored.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the electric fence deal. Growing up, I remember trying to do it, and we continuously grazed. We'd put them in a pasture, and of course they got out when they saw the other side of the fence was a lot better.
Yeah.
So now they sit there and wait for you, and he'll be coming. We'll wait. We're good. So
yeah. Is that a culling criteria? If a sheep is chronically getting out, is she one that needs to go somewhere, whether it's in the freezer or to town?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll chase her down on the 4-wheeler and get rid of her because I don't want her. She'll teach the others. So yeah, it is, and it's been amazing when I first started with that. So like I said, traditionally myself, we were kind of range operation. We had a BLM permit that we'd go to in the spring, and then I had this private lease, and we'd herd them. And so putting them in those fences was kind of new for them. I've had to do things that we talked about, like I changed genetics a little bit, things to fit what works for me. And there was that first year, my wife and I think she's about ready to divorce me for having to transition. And it was a little challenge, but I remember one night and those things, it just right before dark, and they were getting antsy, and they crashed that fence down right at dark, and then to now where it's like, I think I've had them get out once, and that was because the wind blew my fence over or something like that, and they moved early on me this year, but I think that was like one time this year. So
yep.
Yeah,
that's a unique challenge of the West when the wind blows your fence over, but
yeah,
for sure. So yeah, you mentioned some of the what are some of the considerations when you move to this more regenerative style of management? You mentioned genetics. We can talk about that. We should talk about that. What are some of the other ones as well that we should look at?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the thing. And when you go to that range, and I like to say the range, I love it. I still love it. It's still to me, if it's done correctly, it's just like management intensive grazing on the mountain, right? I mean, you've got a guy with 1,000 ewes, big numbers, and I think that's what really fits it. Big numbers, moving constantly, and that aspect of that herding aspect of those sheep, and they are trained to do that. If I take my sheep now and I put them on the mountain to herd, they wouldn't do it. They would scatter to the four ends of the earth, you know. But those are strong. This is one of the reasons why most of the sheep out west are Rambouillet or that white-faced Targhee Columbia type, is because of that herding instinct that they have, that some of these other breeds don't. And even hair sheep, you know, I think you could train them to that point. I don't know. I've never been around hair sheep as much. But the wool sheep, you know, they get to the point that, like I said, one guy handles 1,000 head or more and can do really well with that. And so when I transitioned, you know, we had tried that and just didn't really have the numbers, didn't have the permits, didn't have things like that. So breed wise, I've had Targhee for quite a few years now, and they've worked really well. I love the wool. I wear wool every day. I'm just still attached to that wool, and a lot of the Western range breeds are large. I've heard guys from back east come out here and be like, "Holy smokes, that's a cow, not a sheep." You know, there is some very large, whether that's good, bad, ugly, and different. I try to keep a moderate type frame sheep, but that's still for me, that's 165 to 185 pound ewe. Those market lambs over, 160, depending on what they are. So when I started into this, I actually started looking at some Dorset and Polypay type genetics that I've mixed in there. And that's my lambing percentage is right around 185%. I always shoot for 165% weaning. And I attribute that to those genetics, and still with that Targhee influence, the wool clips fairly good, even though right now value of wool's down, but that's not my main crop. That's not, it's always interesting. I actually ship my wool back to South Dakota to Center of the Nation Wool. And they're always like, "Do you want to sell this?" I'm like, "Yeah, I don't have that much wool. I don't have enough wool to play with." So, but I do still enjoy it. But primarily it is the lamb production. So crossbreeding is big. I try to get those lambs. So this year, I try to have them 90 pounds by at least 3 months of age. My typical, I actually start lambing about March 15th, which is just a hair earlier than most of the range guys. But I don't have that nice, cool summer mountain to go on. And so I usually will lamb then. And then I will wean right around the 1st of June to middle of June. And I do cover cropping. And I'll hold those lambs on those cover crops, and I'll take those ewes to a drier type pasture that they don't need that nutrition out of. And then graze those lambs. They're used to grazing in that system, and graze those lambs until we sell them. Just around about mid-July is usually when I get rid of those lambs, and I've done really well that way with very minimal inputs in that system. So that's the thing I love about that system, is just the minimal inputs. So
yeah, for sure. So what when are you marketing those lambs? At what weight or what time of year?
Yeah, so they're around 90 pounds. Like I said, about mid-July. So one of the big factors, especially with the Western wool market or the lamb market, is all those guys come off the mountain around the same time, mid-September, 1st of October. When is the low in the lamb market? Typically right then, because there's a whole flood of lambs. So I try to hit before that flush. I also do a fall lambing group. So this year they lambed on pasture in October, and then I'll sell them here in a couple of weeks, which is one of the high points of the market, right? And even this year, the lamb market dropped down really fast this fall, but it's picked back up. And it's been a great time to have extra lambs available. Mine, I like my genetics because they are not the huge, large Western frame type commercial lambs. They can go to a commercial market and finish just fine, but at 85, 90 pounds, they hit the ethnic demand. And so if that ethnic market wants them, I can get rid of those lambs and have more options with them. That's one of the things with a lot of the Western sheep. The breed's really big, and we've got some other great big crossbred lambs, and they fit that commercial market really well. I mean, they're taking those lambs to 180 plus pounds before they harvest them, and they're big, they're huge. But I like my genetics to where, at an 85, 90 pound lamb, they look like they fit the ethnic bill, right? They're full, but at the same time, if they wanted to finish those lambs out in a commercial market, they could. So, and that's where a lot of my lambs, I've worked with a order buyer essentially, and they'll either go to, sometimes they go California, sometimes they go Colorado. Sometimes they do go to the ethnic market, just depending on what he finds. So
let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, PowerFlex Supply. PowerFlex Supply is far from another big box store. They're staffed by expert ranchers who use everything they sell in their own operations. Those same experts enable PowerFlex Supply to offer the Rancher Success Program, a free service that will help you develop your grazing infrastructure plan down to the specific products you need for your livestock, species, region, style of grazing, and budget. For 25 years, PowerFlex Supply has been guided by one rule. If their employees won't use a product on their own pastures, they won't sell it to you. That means the permanent and portable electric fencing and livestock water systems and rotational grazing supplies they do stock have been hand-selected to be the best you can get. PowerFlex Supply is a leading North American distributor of Gallagher, O'Brien's, Speedrite, Strainrite, and many more. And if they couldn't find an existing product, PowerFlex Supply makes it themselves, including their legendary Super 9 polybraid and rugged spinning Jenny. Visit powerflexsupply.com to get started. Talk to me a little bit more about that ethnic market, some of what they're looking for, and some of that, in my understanding, is kind of timed to some of the major holidays and some of those, ethnic religious type events that they've got going on, Passover and other things like that, kind of play a role in that market as well, to my understanding. So is there more going on there?
Oh yeah. And that's one I wish I knew it better than I do. I spent a whole day in a workshop trying to learn it. And I come out of that workshop thinking I need a middleman for this because I don't understand this. So it is good. And they do. There are certain holidays that they want. Those holidays move dates every year, right? They're not the same date every year, but they're very close. Yep. So that it's hard to figure out when those markets are, and then how many they want or what they want. There's I'm trying to think, the one that's, I can't remember if it's Ramadan or another one, but basically it's when Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, right? And there was a ram in the bush, and he was a curled horned ram, long tail. So that's what they want. No blemish, not even an ear tag, not anything. And at other times, there's certain ones that they just want a lamb, or I learned, some ethnic groups, they don't want a lamb. They want a mutton. They want an old mutton, and they'll pay more money for an old mutton than a nice fresh lamb because that's what they're used to eating in their culture. So yeah, I spent a whole week a whole day at a conference trying to learn this, and came away thinking I want a middleman. I wish I was better at it, but there's so many factors there. But a lot of times they want that lighter lamb because it's a meal. It's a sit down, cook the whole lamb at once. It's a meal feast like that. So they don't want a 180-pound commercial type lamb. They want that 85, 90-pound lamb that gives them, 35 to 40 pounds of meat that they can roast and cook for the whole family for a meal. And there's other things to it. I mean, they have to, sometimes some of them have to buy a lamb for their neighbor or for their friends, or, so it's real interesting. But, that's kind of what's neat since COVID even, is there has been a 30% increase in lamb consumption, which when it's less than a pound per person per, year, 30% isn't very much, but it's a win for us. So anyway, and a lot of that's attributed to the ethnic population, but then people trying lamb again.
Yeah.
So
yeah, for sure. I've eaten more lamb in the last 5 years than I have my whole life before that. That's for darn sure. So
yeah.
My wife and I were loading sheep, and we're not really set up for sheep necessarily. We were loading lambs to go to market this last year, and one of them got out, and we're like, meh, we'll eat him later.
Well, that's what usually happens when we get a younger ewe. And I like mutton. I'm a mutton fan, but it's a young, fresh mutton. And I've even had, well, it was interesting. I had several people say, I'd rather have one of those young, prime, fat muttons than I would a lamb. It just depends on preference. But that's about what me and my wife eat, is that ewe that gave us grief or something, or a lamb that we haven't sold that we've raised for a little while. So.
Yep. Yeah. And so the mutton, have they had a lamb in their life?
Yeah, sometimes. So what I'll do is let's say they're a 2 or 3 year old ewe, and they, for some reason, didn't breed or something, then they're already fat. So I actually, this last week, I do ultrasound my ewes early so I can determine what's there and try not to waste feed. Because I bring them into my kraal to shed lamb. So they'll be in a kraal for about 30 days getting fed, and then once they lamb, they go back to pasture essentially. And so we will ultrasound, and those are some great ones to market, because there is actually market. The mutton market this year actually stayed fairly high too, which was very interesting. It was high and the lamb market was down. But again, ethnic demand was there for it. So
yeah, for sure. And that shed lambing, those are jugs then, is that right?
Yeah, so we have, it's actually Sanpete County where I'm located is an old turkey farm. It's still, I shouldn't say old, it is a turkey producing area. We bought an old turkey farm, and then we use those sheds to bring them in and put them in a jug for about 24 hours, just to make sure that ewe's bonded. Especially, like I said, I want my lambing percentage up to 185%. And within a day, they're out of those jugs into mixing pens of about 8 to 10. And then after about a week, maybe 2 weeks, depending on the weather, they'll go out to pasture after that. And we usually try to keep them in groups of 50 to 100. And then, like I said, by about April 15th, the last tail end of them, I go to my irrigated. And I actually, at that point, I graze really quick. One of the benefits I found with my sheep, and I learned this when we were growing alfalfa hay, is if I can graze those sheep on that alfalfa between April 15th and May 15th really fast, the weevil goes down. You hit the weevil, the hoof action knocks a lot of that weevil, and the alfalfa at that time's hot. They don't want it. They know, and they eat a bunch of that. It gives them a gut ache, and they avoid it, but they go for all the weeds. And then you get them off of there, and your yields, it does nothing to your yields, essentially. In fact, I found that it'll increase your yields because essentially you fertilized at the same time with the sheep, and then you got rid of most of the competition. So I'll do that. I don't cut very much hay. I do have a pull behind swather and a round baler. I will say that's one of the biggest things I've learned is, and we're going into a drought this year, is stocking. How much, right? Like last year and the year before that, I cut hay because I had extra feed. This year, I don't know going in right now how much we'll cut, but that's kind of learning and observing, okay, where do I want to stock? And honestly, truly in our operation, what we're looking at is, okay, where is that maybe the drought level for the sheep, and then bringing on something like stalker steers through the growing season to make up for that. I'm not big into cutting the hay. It's nice. I can put it in the barn. Typically, if I do it, I'll cut one crop and then I'll graze the next one. And then I might cut a third off of that same piece of ground or something like that. I'll rotate it around. So at some point it's getting grazed. But again, we're to that point where I'd love to figure out, and I'm kind of getting there now. The problem was a couple of years ago, I sold down because we were in a really bad drought, and then I got my numbers where I thought we were, and I'm pretty close. This year is going to test it, and see if we're right there, that stocking I want, and then be able to pull those when I wean those lambs the 1st of June. Those ewes don't need that high quality feed, and they can go to a drier range type pasture and bring in some stalker steers and produce more per acre, essentially, improve my profits per acre. So
sure. Yeah. And what are some of your strategies for kind of pushing weight on those lambs? You mentioned cover crops. What are some of the things that you're doing there to kind of push them a little bit?
Yeah, and I will say grazing lambs is different than the ewes. I will definitely move those lambs faster. I want them on the best feed, every day, definitely daily moves. And in fact, this year I might go to 2 day moves or 2 a day moves just to make sure that those lambs are always in that high quality forage, making sure that they don't, because you'll get in there with the herd of sheep and within half the day they've got their favorites gone, then and they're after the other stuff, and it's totally fine. But I found moving them in the middle of the day rather than the morning, because so we're really hot and they don't have shade. But if I go like this last year, I had sorghum sudan. I actually had some oats, peas, vetch, and the oats got up to about 3 feet tall. And that's what we started those lambs on. And those lambs could shade up essentially and in those oats, and it kept the ground cooler. So even when they laid down in the afternoon, the ground was cool. And then at night they would really eat, and the first of the next morning they'd really eat in the cool, and then they'd get moved and they'd be on that fresh feed again. And I found that works great to try that, as a way to keep them cool during the heat. And that sorghum sudan, I mean, man, they go in there and they think they're in the Amazon rainforest. So I've grazed sheep through 9 foot tall sorghum sudan, and wondered, am I crazy? And my neighbors think I'm crazy already. So, and I've watched those sheep just push those stalks over and eat them, and it's pretty cool you go in, think they're never going to eat this, and then you're like, holy smokes, it's gone, so yeah.
Yeah, that's how you know you're pushing the paradigm, is when you wonder if I'm crazy.
Yeah. So it's funny. We got a highway that's kind of by, and it's got the rumble strips in the middle, and we're out there all the time. You hear people hit the rumble strip, and you're like, oh, we're getting watched again. So
yeah. Looky-loos. My father-in-law was in law enforcement for 35 years. Looky-loos, that's what he calls them. So,
yeah.
So the genetics you talked about a little bit, the Polypay Dorper, is that right? Dorset.
Yeah, Dorset. Yeah. So I got into Dorsets because of the fall lambing that I was doing and the Polypay. Brought them in with the Targhee. The Polypay is basically a Targhee Dorset on one side and a Finn Rambouillet on the other, and then they cross those back. And so I thought, well, I'm going to do the Targhee Dorset. And then a few years back, I brought in some Polypay genetics just to kind of help with lambing percentage. But I didn't really need, I'll be honest, I didn't really need a lot of help with lambing percentage. Those Targhee ewes, they're great. Here's my plug for Targhee. They're great ewes. I mean, they are good mothers. They're good milkers. They're a medium frame size type sheep, and produce lambs, and the Dorset kind of came in, and the Polypay for that fall lambing type system to try to get them to breed out of season, because most of these ewes, trying to get them to breed out of season doesn't occur. We've used hormones to do it, and it's worked. But genetics, everybody I've talked to even about it says, man, the genetics truly makes those systems work. And it does. It is truly genetics that makes those systems work. And then it minimizes your cost too, if you can get the right genetics. So, and they've done great. I think I still have some old Rambouillet genetics from my dad, and things like that, they do well in that system. And I will say sometimes they get a little fat, because it's like, I don't know what it is. They're used to grubbing, I guess, and they get in that and they get a little fat on you. So you got to kind of watch them. But
yep. Well, they're a desert animal, right?
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, they are. They truly are. That's one thing that the Western sheep industry was truly designed in this area for a reason, because of the browse and forbs and things and the mountainous terrain. They truly fit that system.
Turn them out on a cover crop and they think they're in Missouri.
Yeah. And you got to be careful, some of those cover crops can get them running, I mean, as far as it can be pretty ripe for them. So you got to be careful. I have learned that straight turnips and radishes really gets them going. They need some oats or some fiber in there to counteract that. But they love it. I love bringing people around and they can see that turnip half ate in the ground with the teeth marks in it, and those sheep trying to go at them. So
yeah, I mentioned to you before we started recording my episodes with Dave Olila and talking about sheep, and he said, that's one of his strategies for flushing ewes is right before he turns the bucks out, he'll turn them out into some of those higher quality cover crops and get more multiple bursts that way and everything like that. So that's kind of where I'd like to go next is, how do you handle breeding? What's kind of the strategy turnout? Do you pull the bucks, rams? Do you pull them out? What are some of those things?
Yeah, you bet. I mean, that's a big thing, as you mentioned, flushing, and that's something that's really caught on. You see a lot of these range guys, they'll go to our alfalfa fields in the fall. Flushing is big, and I always try to educate everybody I can on flushing. So my system is about a month before I plan to breed, which I breed in mid-October. One of the other reasons I do that is one of the highest points for ewe gestation as well. They've done a lot of research and studies and found that mid-October is actually one of the highest points for them for ovulation. And it fits my system. I still love lambing later. I do have a group. I breed my ewe lambs and they lamb in June. So my main herd lambs mid-March, my ewe lambs lamb in June, end of May, 1st of June. But about a month before the bucks go in, I will put them on a lower quality feed. And I mean, very, I don't want to say poor because I'm not starving them to death, but I want them on a lower plane of nutrition, barely hitting maintenance even. And then 2 weeks prior, I'll flush them, whether it's a cover crop or whether it's a alfalfa grass pasture or whatever that is. They're right on that. I have seen just increases. The first year I started really doing this system, the grazing system, we lambed 205%, which is, a lot of Western herds. When you look at the average in the United States, their weaning percentage average is 1.05. And I remember I called a buddy, and because I'd made a Facebook post, and he's like, have you really got that many lambs for your use? He's like, that's 200 and something percent. And I'm like, yeah, I do. But it just, that flush is big. And like I said, I will breed my ewe lambs to lamb just over a year old. We just ultrasounded them this weekend, and out of 93 ewe lambs, 73 of those were pregnant with no inputs besides just putting the bucks in. I let them lamb later. They just get more mature, and they lamb on pasture. Most of those yearling ewes will have a single lamb. You'll get, I'm about 120% lambing on those ewe lambs or those yearlings, and then. So I typically pasture lamb them. They're in a mid-grazing system. And so I just kind of leave the ones that lamb back and then move the herd forward. And then I can group a group as I go behind, and they can go another way. And
Sandhills lambing.
Yeah, sandhills lambing. Well, we call it drift lambing. We invented drift lambing before the sandhills calving method. So it's really, they stole that from the sheep guys. That was my great grandparents.
Yeah, did you hear that, Derek? Derek, I hope you're listening.
That's all we say. You cow guys always steal it from the sheep guys first. So I even watched the deal on in herding, and it's the older Idaho. I can't think of their name. You'll probably hear this will keep me out. And I'm like, why can't we just call it herding? Because you stole it from the sheep guys. But it's in herding because a cowboy can't say that, right? So anyway, yeah, so it works great. I like that because it gives me, I have my main group of lambs that I can sell. And then by about fall, those June lambs are ready when everybody else's lambs are coming off the mountain. And usually if I need to, I can send them on a load to some of these guys. They need to fill a semi. So it's like, hey, I've got another 100 or 200 lambs here. And then if I have those fall ewes, I had 80 ewes lamb this fall. And so I've kind of got multiple markets, times 2 market, which is really nice. Because like I said, this fall, the lamb price really dropped down. I can't complain because I hit it really good when I did in July this year. And then now the prices come back up. So hopefully we'll hit it good again here in a couple of weeks and do really well that way. But I love that aspect of having, not my whole lifestyle doesn't revolve around that one single day that the lambs are sold. I've got multiple times and multiple avenues, and we have done some direct marketing. Haven't got as much into that. We did during COVID. We sold quite a few lambs direct market during COVID, but it just kind of, some of that fizzled out a little bit. And we still do direct marketing, but we're just not pushing it as much. So
you mentioned earlier breeding ewes out of season. What do you mean by that? What is the season, and what are some of the things you're trying to do by breeding them out of season?
Yeah, you bet. So most ewes are seasonal breeders. And that's the fall time, just like your deer and elk and things would be. They're seasonal. So typically they'll start cycling in end of July, 1st of August. And then by January, it tapers off quite a bit. You can get some ewes even beyond that, but that's typical season for for sheep, and it's all based off of the light.
Right. That is,
So
it's the
when the
photo period,
daylight,
right? Yep.
yeah, when the daylight hours get less, they start to cycle. And like I said, they about October 15th has been one of those peaks of ovulation, essentially. I grew up lambing all the time in April, and it just worked good for what we're doing now to kind of push it up just a little bit. And anyway, so in the fall, right? So they're getting bred in April or May to get those fall lambs, and that is out of season, right? Daylight hours are getting longer. So we've done several things. There's hormone treatments. When we first started, and I decided to do this, I actually went around the valley and bought up a bunch of old ewes that hadn't lambed, and then I used those, and I got about 50% of them pregnant. And I did that for a year or two, and I gave up because it was a struggle. And like I said, genetics, you can't find Dorset genetics where I'm at even. A lot of those are back east or on the West Coast. Even polypay genetics, there's not hardly any of those around. And so I actually gave up. And then my dad ended up passing away, and he still had this little bunch of 50 ewes. And unbeknownst to me, I had this little ram in there. And I ended up having about 30 of those ewes breed out of season naturally. So there was my start again. I thought, okay, well, we're going to use those genetics because obviously they work. And we started using that. And so now I've got a lot of that genetic. So like I just told you, we just got done ultrasounding ewe lambs. So those 20 that weren't bred, I will try to breed them here in April and May. And then if they don't breed, then I'll sell them. They're good time to market, right? They're a yearling ewe. There's really nothing wrong with them at all. They just didn't lamb as a ewe lamb, and they didn't lamb in this fall group. But for a yearling ewe to market to somebody else, they're perfect set to market. So that's kind of what we've done with those. And it fluctuates. One year I had 50% of the ewe lambs, so then you kind of got more. But I really select for twins. I buy rams that are twins. I only keep ewe lambs that are twins, and I just use an ear notch to market. So a single lamb doesn't have an ear notch. A twin has one. A triplet has three. So when I select replacements, I select my twins and triplets first, and it's worked wonders. And then genetics. I mean, same thing. My wife cussed me out a few years ago because I went to a sale and got too involved in the sale, right, and ended up buying some rams I probably shouldn't have. And they were a little different genetic, but boy, they sure look good. And I can tell that every one of the ewe lambs that I kept out of those, because even though they were born a twin, they don't have the twinning genetics. So it was interesting. Genetics still play a big part in that. So.
Yeah, for sure. And, I don't know if it contributes to it, but those single ewe lambs that you don't want to keep because they're not twins, not having a blemish also helps, I suppose, with that ethnic market, right? Is that part of what you're thinking about?
Yeah, and that's a nice thing. They're the biggest ones most of the time, right? They're the biggest, healthiest, nice ones, and it looks good. They're like, why are you selling these? Oh, they're good. Don't worry. They're perfect. So you hate to tell them, like, well, I want twins, and I don't know if they're going to carry that gene. So yeah, but they do. They fit. They grow fast. They're some of the heaviest lambs. So, and I've done that before where I've marketed those like the 1st of July because they're right at that 85, 90 pounds right off the bat, and man, it's good to pick those up and off they go, so.
Right.
And we really cold heavy even this last year. Typically what I've started doing is if I have a ewe that has a single, I'll notch her tag. And if the next year she comes through and she has a single, she's gone. So I usually, if it's a ewe lamb, a single's not a big deal. That's pretty good. She's lambing to start with. Mm-hmm. And then, but if she comes back the next year with another single, she's gone. So,
yep. And that is a fairly high, from my understanding, lambing percentage on the ewe lambs to get that many to catch and to lamb. And you said you're not doing anything for them. Do you think that's genetics that you've just developed over time? Found those more fertile ones that are going to be more early sexually maturing, kind of lambs? Is that what's going on there, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to cattle, and I know that's one of like Burke Teichert's things is expose all those heifers, and mm-hmm. and you see those ones that are sexually mature earlier. That is one thing I will say, framing down. Right, you get sexually mature ewe lambs at a quicker time. They're not trying to fill that big frame, and honestly, just like you said, those ewe lambs I have with a big frame, they're the ones that tend to be open, and I do think it is a lot of genetic selection that way. And I remember one time I was like 25%. The year before I was like 75, and I was like, what the heck happened here, And there is some timing factors. I found that if say most of them are the end of December, 1st of January, they're getting bred. If there can be some weather factors that can throw them off. That's why I like to even rebreed for the fall. And like I said, those fall ewes we did this year, we exposed 94, I think, and ended up with 80 of them that were bred. So they were still, and my lambing percentage when I just ran the bucks with them that fall to try to get them, I only had about 60% that bred. So I was it's nice to see that. It is a little bit more labor intensive. I will say that lambing, they are just like a heifer. They are dumb sometimes. You think they'll have a lamb turn around, start bunting the thing because they don't know what it is, and it is nice to have the lambing jugs at that point because I can bring them in a jug. But at the same time, most of those I do lamb on pasture, and I just feel getting out of the way, letting them figure out has worked really good, and my death loss is not very high. Very, very minimal having to help anything. But being in those intensive grazing pastures at that time, if something has trouble, I can easily catch it too. So that hasn't been as big a deal.
Yeah, and I think also another contributing factor probably has something to do with those lambs are born in March, and then you're not breeding them till they're going to lamb in June, so they got a couple extra months anyways to grow a little bit, and you're kind of right in the heart of their breeding period, their photosensitivity, all those things are kind of stacking up to help as well, I suppose.
Oh yeah, for sure, and that's why I like it, because anybody that's run sheep, that as soon as that green feed comes on in the spring, it's like they just kick up another gear and really grow, and the maturity on them is there. They just get a few extra months to mature, put that size on. I have, when I first started doing it, I'd lamb them with my main herd, and you could tell some of them it was hard on them, but man, if you can just give them a couple extra months and they just take off and grow, it seems like. So
sure. What about parasites? Are you doing anything to manage parasites?
So, traditionally the biggest thing, the nice thing about out west is it's dry climate. Parasites ain't as big a deal as it is for you guys back there. So it's really nice. Traditionally, we'd do a fall type worming. But I have found by moving the sheep, and anymore, I will worm if I see that I need to worm. Looking at, are they, running on the backside? Is there certain things, there is the test, you can pull the eyelid down and things like that, but you got to run them in a trail for that. So typically this year, none of my lambs got wormed. They're just out on pasture and going. I will say this, one of the nice things, and I've learned this a lot more, like Fred Provenza and those guys, learning that how they'll graze and find things that even help solve that. You'll see, so in the springtime, I run on greasewood, which is almost dead. I mean, it's actually, for sheep, it is amazing. It is high calcium in the spring. It is toxic. So if they consume a ton of it, especially later on, it is toxic. But in the spring, if they can mix that in their diet, those use milk like crazy on that stuff. And where I send those sheep in the spring, I couldn't get a cow to live in that stuff. And they're only there for a few weeks. When I come out of the trails, they're there on that greasewood essentially for a couple of weeks before I can get on my irrigated pastures. But I found they come off of that, and I need to look into it more if there's something that helps with parasites. Typically, like I said, a worming program would be, most of these guys around here, it's fall when they wean lambs, they'll worm ewes and vaccinate or whatever they do then. And that's kind of how traditionally we'd run it. But anymore, with that intensive grazing, I feel like we're killing the parasite life cycle. Yeah. We're moving them, and most of the time mine's interesting. And when I teach people or talk to people about it, observation is the biggest thing, because it's not like I'm moving back every 20 days or every 30 days. In the early spring, I might be about a 20, 25 day rotation in June. And then we get really dry and really hot. I might be 60 days before I come back and graze that again based upon water and temperature and things. But I mean, at that point, that parasite life cycle's gone. And I have really seen uh, not an issue with the parasites near as much. Even looking in the dung, you can see some of them. I don't I don't see hardly any. So like I said, usually what we'll do is if I feel like I need to treat something, I will. I know I should probably cull them and get more parasite resistance. But truly, this I don't know in the last 2 years if we have actually wormed anything, to tell you the truth.
Yep.
So
I've heard it said that if you buy really expensive parasite-resistant genetics and you don't move them regularly, they are not very valuable.
Exactly. That's how I feel too. And that's my other thing. So we have found two different dung beetles on our operation. There's one that shows up in the spring, and then there's one that shows up in the fall. A little one they say is around the turkeys, which we were in turkey country. So I'm the same way. I'm like, I don't want to kill my bugs that I have in my soil. So if I do worm, they actually go to a kraal for a week, and that's where they're at for that week before we ever go back to a pasture.
Nice.
Because I don't want any of that on my pasture. So.
What is the most paradigm challenging thing you're doing on your operation, from the conventional sheep operations you're aware of, or even maybe the more regenerative ones you're aware of? What do you think kind of is the most paradigm challenging thing you're doing?
And that's a really good question, because I look at it when I have and I'm actually on the Utah Wool Growers Board here in Utah as well. And so I present or speak to several of I've presented for the Idaho wool growers, Wyoming wool growers, and those guys. I grew up in that industry. And every time I talk to them, I say, look, I am doing exactly the same thing. If you guys are doing your management and moving those animals, you're doing it on a large scale. Different challenges based on, their lambing percentages maybe aren't quite as high, but they can get pretty good. So I know some guys that are lambing really well. Predators are a big issue, right? Labor issues, things like that. So I always try to say, hey, I am doing the same thing. You can do the same. You got a herder that's keeping these sheep together. You're doing the same thing. But when I get to traditional grazing, that is just continuous of, hey, you just dump them in this pasture and you leave. And when the feed's gone, and to me, there's really two things. There's really nobody around doing what I'm doing, because it's that traditional system. If you've got irrigated ground, you're producing hay, and that's it. It is hay, and you're going to sell that, right?
Yep.
And so when I bought this ground, we don't have great water, and the hay production is really not that good either, And I'm like, man, I can produce. So I figured it out this year on my irrigated pasture, with my grazing. I was about 7.5 ton an acre. If I figured out the number of head, how much they're eating every day, I was around 7.5 ton an acre. The average hay production in our county is 4.2 ton an acre. And so right there, like, even if I'm off by a whole ton, that's down to 6 ton. I mean, it's still
50% higher.
Still higher, and I see that the cover cropping really hasn't taken off. We're actually putting on training in a couple weeks, and they do a big soil health in the West conference with the Utah Soil Health Board down in Utah. Last year they did it every other year, and it's taking off. There's getting more and more people, but it is kind of that factor of, well, this is just how we do it. This is what we're going to do. You go from hay to grain or corn, and then you take that out and you go back to hay and you raise hay, And a lot of that developed because of the range operations. They would grow hay on their irrigated ground in order to feed the animals through the winter. Or most of the sheep guys, they don't, they're on desert pastures, but it'd be when they come into lamb. And so doing this, I've had a lot of people interested. If they see what we're doing. I've got one guy and he's like, let me guess, you're still there in your ground in Chester. I'm like, yeah, I've been there since April. He says, it's November. How are you still grazing it there? One of the best compliments I think I got is I had 2 years ago, we had a really good year, and I had some oats and peas and vetch and stuff that it was getting ahead of me. And so I had my neighbor come in and swath it for me. And he's like, I know what you're doing. I says, I watch you all the time. I can feel the difference in your ground in my swather. I can feel the difference in your ground compared to everybody else I cut for. And but there's still that paradigm shift,
Yeah.
of saying, hey, I need to do this. And I've got a colleague I work with, and we talk about this quite a bit of what is those factors that hold people back from doing something like this. And I think one of those is kind of financial aspects, right? You've got your operating loan, and you've got X amount of hay that's going to pay that operating loan off, and there's just this fear of what if I can't do this, and I will say one of the best things that I've ever done is never take out an operating loan, and maybe that's I've had to grow slow because of that. Nothing I own right now was family ground, anything like that. And so we've had to work into that and buy and build and I think that's one of the best things I've done because my only loan right now is a land loan, and I'm not worried about. I worry about the land loan, but I know that I've not got this other debt load that I've worried about too. And I think sometimes that holds a lot of producers back because they're just kind of like, I'm in my safety net here, So.
Yep. Talk to me about the bale grazing a little bit. Is that something you've done frequently, or talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it just kind of depends. So last year we had quite a bit of snow last year. This year we don't have any snow. I set it up this year. My biggest thing for doing it is soil health, trying to build soil. So I've got one field, and it kind of goes up on this hill, and that hill, it just kind of all the topsoil's gone. It's been farmed off of it through the years before you ever bought that ground. I mean, you go down about 2 inches, you can hit this rock layer in some of it. Like, it's bad. And I've been able to get some good production off of it, and I wanted to just build that soil. And bale grazing with wool sheep is a little different because that's a product that you can sell, right? It does get in their necks. I will say that. My wife swears at me all the time because the value of that wool's gone down, and she really loves it. So, but it works great. I've loved it. I've done it several times. Sometimes I may go to winter type range with very minimal input. Same kind of deal. Those sheep do really well on the browse and things like that, and so I can kind of save a little bit of the hay cost. I don't use. Like this year, I had some barley that I cut for hay and some rained on first crop hay. That's what I used for most of those systems. Right now, I bought some corn stalks. And then so we have corn stalks, and then so it's every other bale. One is a hay bale, the next one's a corn stalk, or an alfalfa bale, next one's a corn stalk bale. Because all I'm doing is maintaining those ewes, and it's worked great. Besides right now, we're too hot and windy. So I went out just a couple hours ago and to check where I was at with my bale grazing, and the wind had blown. I had this beautiful cover on the ground. It was very uniform of the residue, and the wind had picked up and blown half of it away. So, but it has worked great. I get a lot of people wonder, can you do that with sheep? And yes, you can. I do like the round bales. I have done it with square bales. A lot of square bales in our country. We do not have that many round bales. And it works. 3x3 bales work good. But the round bales have worked great. I've loved the round bales to do that bale grazing.
Yeah, very good. Well, anything else that you really wanted to share today that you thought needed to be said in this regard?
No, I think, one of the things I just wanted to kind of highlight, like I said, I've listened to several of your podcasts and really enjoyed it. And it seems like there's getting to be a lot more interest in sheep and kind of highlight there's, some of the differences and similarities between areas in the country. And, I think, like a lot of hair sheep guys go hair sheep because of some of the resources and parasite resistance type things. And, here in the West, still the hair or the wool sheep is really dominant on those range operations. We still love wool. My wife now, we're trying to figure out how to get a mini mill so we can process our own wool. We don't have a ton of wool, and it's not our big paycheck type thing, but we still love the value of wool and what it does and what it can do for the industry. And so anyway, we're always willing. Anybody that's ever interested, I always say come and find me. We typically have done a field day. The last 2 years we've done a field day kind of end of August, 1st of September. Try to be able to get people out and do that. So
yeah, very good. Well, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.
Very good stuff there with Matt. Really appreciate his perspective. This may or may not end up being a week of small ruminants on the Working Cows podcast. We got at least one more episode, Lord willing, maybe two. If you don't hear a small ruminant episode on Wednesday, we will be talking to Frank Hendricks on Friday about his genetic test that is 100% accurate in predicting the tenderness of beef. Is 100% accurate in predicting the tenderness of beef. So look forward to sharing that with you real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.